Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Campus Consortium's exclusive GDPR Assessment Grant Briefing webinar. In today's presentation, we will shed light on what the GDPR Assessment Grant offers and how to make your application stronger to win the grant award. Without further ado, please allow me to present Campus Consortium.
Colleagues, good afternoon. It's about 1 o'clock here in Chicago. I'd like to welcome the approximately 50-odd institutions who've joined us from throughout what looks like mostly North America to learn about the GDPR grant and how to apply for it. To get started with, I'd like to also thank sponsors of the Campus Consortium for making grants and other projects or sponsoring other projects of the Campus Consortium, including Oracle, Cisco, Unified, Salesforce, and others. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the Campus Consortium, the organization was established in 2003 by 14 research universities that came together to create a nonprofit organization as a shared services entity that could help institutions avoid reinventing the wheel. And GDPR is a really good example. Not everybody's an expert on data privacy or on security. Reinventing the wheel at each institution maybe is not the best idea. The fact that a consortium could run a shared service that institutions could piggyback on, thereby reducing the cost of GDPR assessment and compliance, is really an example of delivering on that 15-plus-year-old mission of the consortium. So that's kind of where the organization came from. Currently, there's quite a large number of members from throughout the world, about 35,000 colleges and universities from countries ranging from Australia to India to Singapore to the US and Canada are part of the Campus Consortium membership. There's a series of grants that the consortium currently has active that you can apply for. This one is the GDPR Assessment Grant. There are grants that support multi-factor authentication, that support artificial intelligence, that support campus safety and other initiatives. And most of these have been created as a response of what the needs are of the consortium's membership. You don't need to be a member of the consortium to apply for a grant from the consortium. These grants are typically, we don't have unlimited funds, so they're typically based on a application, and we really like when there's an existing previous recipient of a grant that is, writing a letter of support and recommendation, because it kind of gives us a sense that what you're, what you're walking into in terms of expectations and level of readiness, and also the value that it would add at your institution. Previous institutions that have won grants, I mean, it's not just big or small. It could, it's Delaware State, Kentucky Wesleyan, McKendree, Oregon State, Dakota Wesleyan. I mean, so many different types of institutions, depending on the grant, the need. And again, some of those items that I outlined earlier are really driving, the selection process from your peers. The selection is, can we award funds that are utilized in a successful outcome is really, I would say, the underlying intent of where applications are more successful. I think everybody, knows what GDPR is roughly, right? Meaning there's this regulation and it has to do with the EU, and, institutions are kind of being forced, especially with students coming out of the EU, to be in compliance with the regulation. So what we are doing with this grant is we're basically delivering the GDPR assessment and the report of where the vulnerabilities are is really what the grant is about. And then, the key would be also obviously to remediate the gaps, and then, close the loop on any items that would be outstanding from an assessment standpoint, so that compliance, you can check the box on GDPR compliance, right? The benefits, I think, are pretty obvious. We're talking about data privacy, student privacy, and a lot of these things like vulnerability assessment and FERPA are somewhat related to an overall compliance framework, but this is pretty specific. Typically, the way in terms of the key components of the grant, in terms of how it works, is there's an assessment that can be done, or a discovery that can be done remotely through a set of questions. That's typically how this starts in terms of capturing some information on people, processes, and technologies. From there, what typically happens is there's a couple of days, at least a couple of days required on campus from an assessor, from an assessment standpoint, and the result of that is typically your audit report that takes a couple of weeks to prepare, because the context obviously is different for each institution, even if you're running Active Directory and Banner, from a technologies or infrastructure standpoint. To kind of break down the phases a little bit, you have kind of a phase one, which is kicking off that project, understanding the lay of the land, and it follows with that more useful few days on campus, because then everyone's prepared for what the assessor is coming in to assess and do, so the time can be most effectively utilized. And then again, essentially the gaps report is key to the process. Typically, institutions, once they have the assessment report, they know what gaps to bridge, and they're good to go from an assessment standpoint. Some of them want a secondary assessment to ensure that the compliance is complete, and they have a letter essentially certifying that the GDPR compliance essentially checklist has been achieved or accomplished. From a process standpoint, we're really looking for an application that you can download from the Campus Consortium's website to be filled in. We would love to see a previous recommendation from a grant recipient in the GDPR. It doesn't have to be GDPR, but we don't want people who are just applying for every grant on the internet. We really want folks that understand the importance of this grant, have a need to accomplish the mission or project that we can help to support. And really, the application is not about showing off. It's just about having the appropriate context in terms of demonstrated understanding of this particular grant scope. More importantly, the process for us is typically we receive grants by the deadline for this one. It's mid-January. If you have an urgent exception or you need a couple of extra hours or days, this is higher ed, so we try to stay on our strict timeline, but we do have flexibility, especially in the January window when it's back to school. We tend to review applications relatively quickly, and this is done by a committee of higher ed executives in terms of from your peer universities. Typically, the group is mostly comprised of CISO, CIO type players with 15, 20, 30 years of experience. Each grant has a different group of individuals that sit on the grant committee, and typically relatively in short order, within a couple of weeks, for those that are selected, a grant award letter is rolled out detailing the extent of the award. Again, we can't always award full grants to everybody. We just don't have the funds. Typically, these overall projects in general range in the $10,000 to $15,000 to $20,000 range in terms of kind of a services engagement, and the grant then covers either 100% of the cost of the assessment or partially covers the cost of the assessment, again, depending on case to case and, how many grants, how many applications, how many awards, are typically made. Typically, we do make between 5 to 10 awards in each grant cycle. From there, we typically connect the institution and the grant delivery agent, meaning the assessor, which for us would be a vendor. A lot of institutions prefer that we service as the program manager on the engagement, with the vendor serving as the subcontractor. You're also welcome to work directly with the subcontractor. And that's a lot of how our grants work. We typically have a technology partner. It could be Cisco, it could be Salesforce, it could be Oculus, that is typically selected as the partner, and typically that provider has done good work in the space, in the higher ed space, are extremely cost effective, for whatever the criterion is for the particular grant in terms of the selection of a particular technology partner. And then typically the project is kicked off, commensurate to a mutual timeline that makes sense. So that's kind of how this works at a, at a high level. The major, and I just wanted quickly to give you an example. Typically, your assessment report is going to look something like this in terms of as you get the report result. It's a dozen odd pages with kind of the assessment results. For those that are technical and have done vulnerability scans, kind of like a vulnerability scan in some sense in terms of assessing, where the gaps are from a report standpoint. So that's what you would expect as a more final artifact from the process. And again, depending on the wherewithal of the team, the remediation can be done by the institution, or it can be done again in terms of rerunning the assessment for a letter of compliance closure. The major kind of process in terms of if you have questions about getting the application or questions on the application, Sharon and her team that coordinate the grant application process are available to help you, or if you're not sure what a question means or how best to answer something. That is something that the Campus Consortium grant application team supports. If you need a connection to a previous grant recipient because you don't know them or want to be introduced to them to obtain a letter of support, that same team, the grant application team and Sharon's team can support you in that process. Again, to make sure that your application is on the best footing. The general notion here is that security and data privacy are really big deals in the space. We have other grants around multi-factor authentication and single sign-on. It's turning into a really, really big issue, and not every institution has a CISO on staff. So this is related to a much bigger initiative from the Campus Consortium to improve security. We're seeing a lot of phishing attacks, a lot of breaches, especially at institutions where the IT staff size might be smaller than a research one. And we felt as a consortium, it's a really important initiative to make sure that we can step up security and data privacy, across our, higher ed community. Again, and we see this as a serious, maybe top 2 or 3 issues in 2019, 2020 that we're focused on. We're going to pause here. Again, we wanted to keep this relatively short. The high level points are, for those of you that want to make sure that you have GDPR compliance done, especially from an external source, you can kind of do one internally, or sometimes it's hard to see the trees from the forest, or it's hard to be the person doing the work and assessing yourself. So for those that need that third party, or just don't have the people to do the checking and testing, that's really what it's for, or might be short funded or short staffed. And again, we'd love to cover 100% for everybody, but the key is for us to make sure that we can get the support out to the most amount of institutions that need the assistance and need the help. And again, if you're a large university, it doesn't mean you're disqualified. It's only for smaller institutions. That's just not the case. But we do want the team there to understand what it's going to take to be successful. And that's why coming into the process, it's much more helpful to understand what the responsibilities are. I want to check if we've got our team on the call. Are there any sort of best practices or suggestions, Manny, that you'd like to make in terms of items that the campuses should be prepared with, or any other kind of important points in the project itself?
Thanks, Jay. Good afternoon, everybody. This is Manny representing campus. One of the things that I'd like to bring to everyone's attention is the violation impact of GDPR as it stands today. As per the GDPR authorities, it's equivalent to 4% of revenue, or up to $20 million, whichever is larger. Keeping that in mind, this becomes an extremely critical exercise that everyone needs to get into. Going back to what Jay said, our assessment methodology is actually broken into two very specific phases. The first being where we do a process vulnerability assessment exercise by sending our auditor on site, an exercise that will last no more than 2 to 3 days, and then parallelly have a remote team do an assessment of your infrastructure as it stands today to understand how vulnerable is your infrastructure in terms of your systems, your network devices, and so on and so forth. That exercise will also take, depending on the size of the infrastructure, no more than 2 to 3 days to complete. Put together, that's a 2 or 3 day set of exercise. And then right after that, we move into a gap assessment report creation, which takes about 2 weeks. So all in all, about 2 to 3 week process. And once you're done, we will present this report to you. And then basis of this report, we will be in a position to do some risk mitigation exercises as well. So for instance, Jay said you could do it in-house, or you would need to look at third party, but GDPR categorically asks when you move into remediation phase that you engage the services of a DPO, a data protection officer, who will be registered with European Union authorities as well, who will be your go-between yourself and the authorities. So that needs to be kept in mind, and that's something that Campus Consortium will help you do as well. That's about it, Jay. That's what I have to add.
Cool, Manny. That's perfect, and thank you for elaborating further. I missed the remote vulnerability component that you added, so thanks for that. For those that want to kind of know more about sort of the way this is going to work, Manny's team can also do that offline drill down in terms of scope and project and those details. But I think it's important, given that where we're at in the time horizon, for those that are serious about this, really get your application. We tried to make the application really simple, not like a giant, college application. In terms of applying for college and writing kind of a personal summary. It's really intended to be tactical, practical, and least invasive, because not everybody's got grant writers or has got the bandwidth to put an application together. So I think that's important. And then do make sure from a GDPR standpoint, it's not just sort of a subset of the team running the initiative. Typically this needs to be kind of brought to the awareness of the CIO or the awareness of the cabinet, because it does, touch things like enrollment or students coming in from Europe, for example. So it's an overall, I think, institutional strategy, versus just a IT security policy type of initiative. We're going to pause again. Questions can be sent into the grant coordination team for assistance on the application, or any further clarifications for more of the technical team or technical operation. For one of the questions that has been asked, you would have the ability to approve the auditor. So you would have the ability to interview and approve the auditor versus just be thrown an auditor and have to live with them. Another question has been asked about the timing. Yes, you would choose the timing in coordination with the auditor instead of being forced to a timeline. Just doesn't work in higher ed, right, in terms of availabilities and plus and minus vacation schedules and, spring break and things of this sort. So I think these are important elements, that are normal higher ed things in terms of flexibility that we all really expect in our space. But these are some of the at least areas of quick feedback. Another answer is yes, the grant can cover the entire assessment. It can cover a part of the assessment, and then if you wanted to proceed with the part grant coverage, you would just cover the differential between what the grant covered and what you would have to cover on your own, or not do the grant in terms of proceed with it, and it would go to the next awardee as appropriate. So hopefully those answer some of the major questions that have come in from this particular
There's another
process.
Question.
Yep.
I'm sorry to cut you. Is the final report published or remaining private by Ms. Wang?
Yeah, so the final report definitely does not get published beyond the confidentiality between the assessor and the institution. We don't want vulnerabilities to be shared, therefore creating a larger vulnerability that an attacker or a compliance group can utilize inappropriately to hurt an institution's rank or credibility or assessment status or accreditation status. So that's a very important point. In fact, recently I was at an institution that had I can't name them, had a major security breach. We fixed it, which was really difficult to do, and we couldn't even market or talk about it or showcase it because it would bring negative light to the institution, even though we pulled off a full recovery on a ransomware attack. So these things are extremely private matters, confidential matters, and the assessment report, the work remains confidential under strict confidentiality agreements between the assessor, assessment team, assessment, and the institution as it should be. So that hopefully that answers that question. And if you can just respond with, if that did answer your question, that would be great. Sharon, anything else that is still outstanding on the questions?
Thank you. There's another question, and that is, there is no line item budget template in the application mentioned. How do we include award amount in our proposals?
So the award amount, it's tricky. So I'll just give you a kind of quick summary. And I don't mean to say anything positive or negative at this point, but there's going to be a difference in the size of the services from one institution to the other, right? Just order of magnitude of doing an assessment on institution A, let's say a large land grant institution versus a small private, is going to differ by way of number of hours that go into the initiative. So generally speaking, our assessment is trying to figure out what is the rough project cost that is going to be entailed. So we don't really expect you to have the sizing of the project cost, but that is going to differ from A to B. And then based on the sense of A to B is really, like, for example, institution A is 35,000, institution B is 12,000. And on the basis of that scope, it's really where the grant line is drawn in terms of full, partial, in terms of an award. So we don't really need you to worry about the full cost of the, because it would be hard for you to assess. What we could utilize is information in the application, or even a discussion with our grant coordination team to be able to really get you and us a semblance of what that scope is going to look like. Without that discussion, we typically are looking at some of the institutional profile parameters, like IPEDs, like type of institution, some general information, so we can get a sense of what we're dealing with in terms of order of magnitude. This is not a $200,000 initiative, and it's not a $200 initiative. So the orders of magnitude tend to be in that 10 to 30,000 range by way of kind of the overall assessment hours that the initiative typically requires or would take. I hope that answers that question. Sharon, let me know if it does and if there's anything else that you've got coming in.